Wang seeing off district defender Du to his post in Shuzhou. Chang'an's walls protect the three Qin lands. Through the wind and smoke, I can't see the 5 forts. These thoughts as I part from you, both of us off again as our duty takes us. In the whole world, there is just you, my friend. No matter how far you go, we will be like neighbors. So don't stand here at this fork in our road, crying like a child, tears soaking your clothes. So we continue with a 5-word regulated verse. Now, this section of the book was introduced with two relatively important figures from the High Tang period. The emperor himself, Xuanzong, who ruled for the first half of the 8th century, and one of his prime ministers, and also a great poet and patron of other poets, Zhang Yuling. Now, the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The next 5 poems in this section take us to a previous era in time, so they're not quite placed in chronological order. The next 5 authors that we will talk about are writers of the early Tang period, which is basically the 7th century of our era. The Tang dynasty started in around 618, so its first century was, slightly convulsive from the point of view that a civil war had to take place before the Tang rose to power. It was a time of military expansion and power, especially the second emperor, Taizong, was a great ruler who subdued the Turks and forced them to obey and assimilate the Chinese command. Now, literally speaking, the early Tang period was basically characterized by continuity. The country, the empire had been divided before the Shui and Tang for more than 400 years. Different cultures had developed in the north of China, which had been mostly ruled by barbarian dynasties, and the south of China. The poetry of the south of China in the period of Disyunion was still the poetry that was taken as the model in the early Tang dynasty. This is what is called usually the Kung Tishi, the court style. And it was a very ornate, baroque, decorative, ornamental style, a bit vacuous on topics. Generally, it was, poems describing life at court or beautiful women at court. Now, the period of Disunion was the first time when poetry for poetry's sake started to be developed. So these poems written during the period of disunion and model on them in the early Tang were a poetry that was later accused, especially in the High Tang and later on, as being decadent and effete, lacking in moral power. And out of the 5 poems that we're going to read in the following days, the first 2 represent a bit of a backlash, an attempt at overcoming the traditions of courtly style poetry, whereas the other 3 are typical representatives of that sort of court style poetry. So today's poet is Wang Bo. Now, Wang Bo formed a group. This group is more theoretical than real. It was created by critics after the time. But he forms a group with 4 other poets of the 7th century, which are generally called the 4 worthies, the 4 models of the early Tang, Chu Tang Si Ye. So these were the poets Luo Bingwang, Lu Zhaoling, Wang Bo, and Yang Jiong. Of these 4 poets, only 2 appear represented in this anthology. Wang Bo in the poem we have just read, and in the next one, Luo Bingwang. So what did these poems have in common? Together with one poet that we've already encountered, Chen Zuang, who was also from this period, and together with another we haven't yet seen, Wan Ji, which doesn't appear in the anthology. All these poets, as I've just said, tried to move away from the ornamented style of the period of disunion. Also, the early Tang was the period in which the experimentations on metrical form, which had been done in the 6 dynasties, culminated into the regulated poem. It was still an experimental genre in this time, as can be seen probably in Wambo's text over here, which probably abuses the parallelism it tries it's still fighting with constructing a naturally flowing and sounding parallelism of syntax and of meaning in the poem that we have here. Very quickly, very briefly, about Wang Bo. Wang Bo was a child prodigy. He lived a very short life. He died when he was 27 years old. Already from the age of 9, he was composing literary works. Very soon he passed the Jinshi examination. He served in the court of one of the feudal lords, but because of a text he wrote making fun of cockfights, which the emperor disliked, he was demoted and sent to Sichuan. Later on, he fell into trouble again because of his killing one of his servants. He was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted. His father had been punished as well for his crimes and sent as a provincial official to Vietnam. While traveling to meet his father or coming back from meeting his father in the extreme south, Wang Bo suffered a boat accident and he drowned when he was, as I say, only 27. Now, Wang Bo didn't leave a very big over, as far as I know. His most famous text is not a poem. It's actually a prose text about describing the pavilion of King Tang, which was, a building from the past. And it's a very famous work in many anthologies of Chinese literature. It's generally included, and it's the quintessential example of Pian Wen, or parallel prose, which was a genre that was cultivated a lot in the period of disunion and in the Tang, but that later fell out of favor with the triumph of the Ku Wen movement, of the simple old-style prose. Okay, so having given all this information, we can now focus on the poem, which is very brief, and there's not that much to say about it, so we could afford this little detour through the early Tang and through Wang Bo's biography. Now, the topic of this poem is a topic we've encountered in many poems before: separation of friends, parting. And it's relatively conventional in that it's describing the separation of two friends. One of them is Wang Bo, the other is a district defender Du. District defender Du is being sent to Suzhou, that is the region of Shu in the west. We don't know where Wang Bo is being sent to. Maybe he's in the capital, or maybe he's being sent somewhere else. We're not sure. Anyway, there's this separation, and this poem it represents words of consolation that Wang Bo directs to his friend. So basically, it's pretty easy to follow, pretty easy to interpret. He's basically saying, in a paraphrase, hey, you're going your way to one region, I'm going my own way to another region. But even though we might be a long distance apart, we will be always close together in our affections. We'll continue being friends. Yeah. So there's no point in crying now. Let's not cry. Stop crying now that we have to part and that we've reached the fork in our respective roads. Let's take a look at it couplet by couplet as usual. Chang'an's walls protect the three Qin lands. Through the wind and smoke, I can't see the five forts. So the poem begins with probably with an image of the two destinations to which the two people are traveling, or maybe the starting point of both people, and one of the ends of the way of one of the two persons. So we start with Chang'an, that's the capital area, and it says Chang'an's walls protect the three Qin lands. So the three Qin, that was a conventional name sometimes used for the region of Qin, because during the beginning of the imperial era, that territory was divided into three kingdoms, then they were conquered again. So that region was called sometimes the Three Qin. Maybe there were three provinces also later in the heartland. But anyway, it's just a fancy way of calling the area around the capital, which is also called sometimes Guangzhong, the land within the passes. So the walls of Chang'an protect this area. They protect the capital, but they're strong enough to protect the area. Through the wind and smoke, I can't see the five forts. Now, the five forts I have checked were 5 river crossings of the Min River, which was located in Sichuan, or ancient Shu, which is the region where District Defender Du is traveling to. So we have the two axial points, the capital on the one hand, and the five fords of the Min River in Sichuan on the other hand. Notice the parallelism, yeah? The three chin, the five fords. So this is what I was mentioning, this was what I was pointing at when talking about parallelism. This poem, probably in the original, uses parallelism in almost all of the couplets, probably in the first couplet as well as in the second and third. So the first couplet situates us into those two extremes where the two poets are centered. Not the two poets, the two friends are centered. Second couplet. These thoughts, as I part from you, both of us off again as our duty takes us. So what are the thoughts? So this couplet continues to explain, as usually the first four lines of a Lu Shi do. They generally create the background of the poem. So the first line located as geographically, the second one locates the situation. We are parting. Yeah, the second couplet, sorry. Wang Bo is thinking about what to say, or is sharing his feelings about this moment of parting between him and his friend. And what are those thoughts? We will see in the next two couplets. In the whole world, there is just you, my friend. No matter how far you go, we will be like neighbors. So there's all under heaven, only you. And no matter how far, we two neighbors. So, here probably the parallelistic nature of the couplet would be very evident in the original. Even in translation, it's easy to perceive. So there is an antithetical contrast also. Yeah, in the whole wide world, yeah, which is immense, there is only you. And no matter how far you go, no matter how big the distance, we're neighbors. We are close by. We're neighbors in our affection, even if we're miles and miles and miles, hundreds or thousands of miles apart. Conclusion. So don't stand here at this fork in the road, crying like a child, tears soaking your robes. So let's put an end to this crying and this lamentation. We will keep being friends. Distance will not be able to destroy our friendship, and let's cease our crying, our lamenting. That crying and lamenting is effective in showing the intensity of feeling between the friends, but it's also very clear that Wang Bo adopts a more mature, a more rational voice, probably in contradistinction to his youth. Well, when he tells his friend, let's stop crying, we will keep being friends even if we're apart. So, pretty conventional poem on separation and on the sadness that separation brings about. Interesting mainly, as I said, for its early experimentation with the parallelism that is so characteristic of the regulated poem of the Lu Shi form.